They wrapped his corpse in straw like garbage. No ceremony, no prayers. Just a teenage boy's body, smuggled out of the palace in the dead of night. This wasn't some peasant. This was Henry Fitzroy, the firstborn son of Henry VIII, once destined to rule all of England. He died at 17, his body so ravaged that even his own father refused to look at him. Within hours, he was erased from history. But what really killed him? The truth is darker than you think. Hit subscribe, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about the Tudors. June 1519. A child is born in secret, yet everyone at court feels the impact. A young woman named Bessie Blount, one of Henry VIII's mistresses, gives birth to a boy. Not just any boy, but the living proof the king has been desperate for. A healthy son. While Catherine of Aragon struggles to give Henry a surviving male heir, this quiet arrival changes everything. The king cannot claim him openly, but he will not ignore him either. In a bold move, he gives the boy a loaded name, Henry Fitzroy, son of the king. From the start, his very existence is both a triumph and a problem. Bessie is quickly pushed out of the spotlight. As was common in Tudor politics, she is married off to another man, neatly moved aside so the scandal doesn't stain the king. The child, however, is a different matter. Henry orders that the boy be raised with care and status, far beyond that of an ordinary illegitimate child. Servants, tutors, and guardians are appointed. He is not officially a prince, yet nothing about his treatment feels ordinary. People at court begin to whisper. If the king can father a strong son with Bessie, perhaps the fault for the lack of male heirs lies not with him, but with Catherine. As the boy grows, a gap between his legal status and his reality widens. Technically, Henry Fitzroy has no claim to the throne. English law does not recognize a bastard as heir, but the way doors open for him tells a different story. Powerful men circle around his future, seeing possibilities. He is watched closely by those who hope he might one day be legitimized, and by those who fear what that would mean for their own positions. Every step he takes at court is quietly measured against one terrifying question. What if the king decides to make this boy his official successor? This tension shapes Henry Fitzroy's childhood. He is sent away from his mother's world, and into one crafted for him by ambition. The royal court dresses him, educates him, and places him in an environment where he learns to move among nobles, clerics, and courtiers as if he belongs there. Yet behind the scenes, everyone knows the truth carved into his name. He is a son acknowledged, but not fully accepted, elevated, but never entirely secure. That fragile balance between honor and exclusion is what sets the stage for the next phase of his life, when Henry VIII decides to turn this illegitimate boy into something far more dangerous, a potential replacement for a failing dynasty. As Henry Fitzroy grows, the gap between the quiet, secret birth and his public role at court becomes impossible to ignore. By the time he is 6 years old, Henry VIII is no longer content to keep his son in the shadows. The king is aging. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon has not produced a surviving prince, and his frustration has turned into a dangerous kind of urgency. In 1525, that urgency explodes into a single dramatic gesture. Henry decides to parade his illegitimate child in front of the kingdom's most powerful men and give him honors no other royal bastard has ever received. The scene is Bridewell Palace, packed with nobles, bishops, and courtiers summoned to witness something they do not fully understand. A small boy steps forward, dressed finely, carrying himself with the seriousness of someone who has been told this moment matters. This is Henry Fitzroy. In a highly symbolic ceremony, he is granted not one, but two major titles, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, and Earl of Nottingham. For a child who, by law, should stand outside the line of succession, these are staggering promotions. Dukedoms of this level are normally reserved for close royal blood. Giving them to Fitzroy sends a silent, chilling message. If the king wishes, this boy can be shaped into a rival to any legitimate heir. Around him stand men who understand exactly what is happening. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Senior clergy and high-ranking courtiers. They see a pattern forming. This is not a token gesture of affection from a proud father. It is the careful construction of an alternative future. Henry Fitzroy is also appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and given responsibilities in the north of England to powerful councils. Of course, at his age, others act in his name. But the titles are real, and they place him above almost every other noble in the realm in terms of rank. For Fitzroy himself, his sudden elevation reshapes daily life. He now has his own household, his own servants, and residences that reflect his new status. He moves through spaces designed for princes, even though that word is never officially used. Tutors are brought in to match the expectations placed on him. He must learn languages, diplomacy, swordsmanship, and the etiquette of a man who might one day command armies or sit at the center of government. He is still a child, but every lesson he receives carries a hint of a larger, unspoken purpose. These changes don't erase the fact that he is illegitimate, but they blur the lines in a way that makes people uneasy. Some begin to treat him as a kind of unofficial prince, testing how far they can acknowledge his importance without openly challenging the laws of succession. Others watch more cautiously, understanding that the higher Henry Fitzroy rises, the more dangerous he becomes to Princess Mary, to foreign alliances, and to anyone whose power depends on the current order. In this atmosphere, his new titles are not just honors. They are a warning that Henry VIII is willing to rewrite expectations if pushed far enough. That quiet tension will shape every relationship and decision that comes next. As Henry Fitzroy steps into his new world of titles and privilege, another transformation is happening more quietly. He is being shaped, day by day, into someone who can stand beside kings without flinching. The boy who once existed on the edge of scandal is now given a life built on structure and expectation. His education is no longer just about manners and basic literacy. It is a deliberate project. The men who oversee him understand that if fortune tilts a certain way, this young outsider might one day be needed as more than a decorative noble. His tutors are carefully chosen. Churchmen and scholars drill him in Latin and theology, the languages of power and religion. He is taught to read and write with the precision expected of a high-born leader, not a forgotten child tucked away in the countryside. History, law, and the workings of government are introduced early, because those around him know that knowledge can be as important as blood when succession is uncertain. Alongside this, he learns skills that match his father's image of kingship: hunting, jousting, and the rituals of courtly display. Every ride, every formal meal, every public appearance is practice for a future that no one dares to define openly. Yet the tension never fully disappears. Henry Fitzroy moves through royal spaces with the ease of someone groomed to belong there, but there is always an invisible line he cannot cross. He has no official title, like prince, no legal right to the crown. What he does have is attention. Powerful figures study how the king speaks about him, how often he is summoned, how much trust is placed in those who manage his estates and finances. These details matter in a court where small changes can signal dangerous shifts in favor. When Fitzroy is given responsibilities linked to the north of England and Ireland, it becomes clear he is not just being educated for show. Authority is being attached to his name. For the boy himself, this creates a strange kind of double life. Inside his own household, he is treated with deference that borders on royal. Servants bow, stewards defer, and visiting nobles show a level of respect that goes beyond mere courtesy to a duke. Outside that circle, however, he still carries the mark of his birth. Everyone knows his mother was not a queen. Everyone understands that his future depends entirely on his father's will and the shifting fortunes of Henry VIII's marriages. The same court that dresses him in fine clothes can turn on him in an instant if the king's priorities change. This unstable status shapes his character and the way others respond to him. He learns early to navigate conversations carefully, to observe who flatters him and who keeps their distance. He is close enough to power to feel its heat, but not secure enough to relax in it. As Henry VIII's marital battles intensify, and the question of a male heir becomes more urgent and more dangerous, Henry Fitzroy's polished education and elevated rank start to look less like fatherly generosity and more like preparation. The next stage of his life will show just how valuable and how vulnerable that preparation makes him. While Henry Fitzroy is being molded into a polished young statesman, the game around him turns colder and more calculated. His education and titles have done more than raise his status. They have turned him into a living option. At a court obsessed with heirs and survival, that is both a privilege and a threat. By the mid-1520s, ambassadors and observers are no longer whispering only about Princess Mary. They begin to mention the king's other son, the one receiving honors no other royal bastard has ever enjoyed. Henry Fitzroy's life stops being just a family secret and becomes a political question. That question becomes sharper as Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon deteriorates. The king's frustration over the lack of a surviving male heir bleeds into everything: diplomacy, religion, even private conversations. When Henry starts pushing for an annulment, arguing that his marriage to Catherine was invalid, the existence of Fitzroy hangs in the background like a shadow. If the king can cast off his queen and break with Rome, what else might he be prepared to change? Foreign envoys quietly report home that if no legitimate son appears, the king might seek ways to raise his acknowledged bastard higher than the law currently allows. Inside England, noble families begin to plan around that possibility. Aligning with Fitzroy could mean influence in a future where he is formally recognized as heir, or it could mean ruin if the king's situation changes. This is where the Howards, one of the most powerful dynasties in the realm, make a significant move. They do not challenge the succession outright. Instead, they aim for something more subtle, and in many ways, more dangerous, tying their bloodline directly to the king's unofficial son. If they succeed, whatever happens to Fitzroy's fortunes, their house will be at the center of it. The result is a marriage arrangement that will shape the rest of Fitzroy's brief life. Still a teenager, he is drawn into a union that has little to do with personal choice and everything to do with strategy. The bride is Mary Howard, daughter of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and cousin to a woman who is rapidly rising in the king's favor, Anne Boleyn. For the Howard family, marrying their daughter to Henry Fitzroy is a way of binding themselves even more tightly to the highest levels of power. For the king, it is a way of making his son's position look more anchored, more respectable, without answering the explosive question of succession directly. For Henry Fitzroy, it means stepping into yet another role decided for him by others. He moves from being the king's favored bastard to a husband bound to one of the greatest noble houses in the land. The ceremony will be grand, the names involved illustrious, but underneath the formal vows lies something colder. This boy's future is now officially welded to a family that thrives in Tudor power struggles. It is a move that seems to secure his place, but it also locks him into the same ruthless world that will, in time, help set the stage for his lonely, secret end. By the time Henry Fitzroy is a married teenager, his life is no longer just about privilege. It is about survival inside a court built on fear and ambition. His wedding to Mary Howard ties him directly to the Howard-Boleyn faction, the same circle pushing Henry VIII away from Catherine of Aragon and toward Anne Boleyn. On the surface, it looks like a triumph. The king sees son bound to one of the most powerful families in England. But beneath the celebrations, another reality grows clearer. Fitzroy now stands at the center of a web where his very existence helps some people rise and threatens others. As Anne Boleyn's star climbs, that threat becomes sharper. She gives Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but no living son, and each failed pregnancy makes the question of succession more dangerous. In this tense atmosphere, Henry Fitzroy's carefully crafted image takes on a new edge. He is young, male, and already treated like a near prince. If the king ever decides to set aside legal barriers and legitimize him, Anne's position and her daughter's future could collapse overnight. That fear cannot be spoken openly in a world where one wrong word can mean the tower, so it leaks out in whispers, sideways comments, and the kind of rumors that are meant to wound without leaving fingerprints. Those rumors begin to wrap themselves around Fitzroy's name. Some at court suggest that Anne views him as an obstacle who must be contained. Others claim she resents the way Henry once paraded this illegitimate son as proof of his manhood, while her own pregnancies end in tragedy. Nothing is formally recorded as policy or plot, but the atmosphere around the young duke changes. He is no longer just a backup plan for a desperate king. He is also a living reminder that Henry can produce sons, just not with the woman who has risked everything to become queen. In a palace where perception can be as deadly as poison, that makes him increasingly vulnerable. For Fitzroy himself, daily life still follows the rhythms of a high-ranking noble. Hunting, audiences, letters, the management of estates in his name. But the spaces he moves through, different now. Conversations stop when he enters a room. Alliances around him shift as courtiers try to guess whether the future belongs to Anne's hypothetical son, to Princess Mary, to some yet unborn child, or, in the most unsettling scenario, to the boy who technically shouldn't stand in line at all. He has been raised to play his part with composure, yet he can't control the stories being told about him in corners he never sees. It is in this climate of uncertainty and quiet hostility that the first truly deadly whispers about his fate begin to form, setting the tone for the darker accusations and suspicions that will surround his final months. Henry Fitzroy doesn't live to see the court calm down. Instead, he comes of age at the exact moment everything begins to crack. In early 1536, Anne Boleyn's hold on the king is already weakening miscarriages. Political enemies and Henry's wandering attention all chip away at the woman who once seemed untouchable. Inside that pressure cooker, the young duke, who was once a convenient symbol of the king's virility, turns into something far more dangerous. A reminder of a different future Henry might have chosen. And when fear grips powerful people, they start looking for someone to blame. Whispers turn sharper, more specific. Some claim Anne has spoken of Fitzroy with open bitterness, resenting the way his very existence undercuts her value as the bringer of a male heir. Others insist her supporters see him as a rival whose presence keeps alive the idea that the king could still abandon his new queen and legitimize the boy instead. Rumors begin to attach Anne, not just to jealousy, but to something darker. Talk of harm and removal, the kind of vague, dangerous language that lets people imagine plots without ever seeing proof. In a court where accusations can be weaponized, those stories take on a life of their own. Then, everything moves brutally fast. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn is arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The official accusations focus on alleged affairs and a supposed conspiracy against the king. But underneath those headlines, the older fears remain. When Henry VIII calls for his son and speaks of having narrowly escaped a venomous threat, it isn't just theatrical anger. It reflects the way poison, real or imagined, has become the language of betrayal at his court. For Henry Fitzroy, hearing that his stepmother has been painted as someone willing to destroy him as well as the king draws him straight into the heart of the drama. The boy who grew up learning how to carry himself like a prince suddenly finds himself standing at the edge of a scaffolded world collapsing in front of him. He has watched factions build careers around Anne, watched marriages including his own used as tools in that rise. Now he watches the same machine grind her down. When the axe falls on the queen, it doesn't just end her life. It sends a clear message to everyone who has ever been seen as a potential problem in the line of succession. Fitzroy's name has been on people's lips for years as a possible solution or a threat, depending on who is speaking. In the aftermath of Anne's execution, that history will feed directly into the rumors about what happens to him next, and why his final days look so sudden, so secret, and so convenient to those desperate to close every loose thread around the king. In the weeks after Anne Boleyn's fall, the Tudor court feels like a house where the windows are shut, but everyone is still whispering. Henry Fitzroy walks through corridors that have seen a queen dragged down and executed, and he knows the palace hasn't finished devouring its own. On paper, he has survived the storm. The woman rumored to resent his existence is gone, and the king has turned his attention to Jane Seymour. But survival at Henry VIII's court is never that simple. The same atmosphere of fear that helped destroy Anne now settles over everyone connected to the question of heirs. And Fitzroy is right in the middle of that question. At first, nothing looks dramatically wrong. Through the spring and early summer of 1536, Fitzroy appears in public, attends events, and carries out the expected duties of a high-ranking noble. Observers note his presence. No one records some long, drawn-out decline. That detail matters, because what happens next is not a slow fading, but a sudden turn. Somewhere between the celebrations for Jane Seymour and the quiet, uneasy weeks that follow, reports start to surface that the king's son is unwell. It begins with vague phrases. He is sickly. He suffers from consumption. The kind of language people use when they don't yet grasp how serious an illness is, or when they are afraid to describe it too clearly. Consumption is a word everyone in Tudor England understands. It conjures the image of a body slowly being eaten away from within. Weight loss, persistent cough, weakness, breath that grows shorter by the day. Whether Fitzroy's condition was true tuberculosis or some other fierce infection, what people around him saw was a teenager who had once ridden, hunted, and moved with the confidence of a favored son, now shrinking into his bed. The contrast between the boy, who had been paraded as a symbol of strength, and the one gasping for air in a private chamber was brutal. And while doctors did what little they could bleeding, herbal remedies, prayers, they had no real weapon against a disease that targeted the lungs. What makes his decline feel even more unsettling is the speed. Accounts suggest that the time between the first clear signs of serious illness and his death was short, far shorter than the long, wasting years sometimes associated with chronic sickness. One moment, Henry Fitzroy is still part of public life. The next, he is effectively shut away, his condition described in dark, anxious tones. The court, already shaken by the execution of a queen, now hears rumors that the king's only acknowledged son is failing fast. For those who have spent years calculating their futures around the question of who might one day wear the crown, it feels like the foundations are shifting again. Inside that closed room, the world must have felt painfully small to Fitzroy. The boy raised to ride out at the head of processions now depends on attendants to move, eat, and breathe in relative comfort. Every visit, every whispered consultation at his bedside carries an unspoken question. Is this just another fever that will pass, or the beginning of the end? Outside, no official statements are made, no public prayers ordered for his recovery on the scale a legitimate prince might receive. His illness is real, his suffering is real, but the response to both is strangely muted, almost as if the court is waiting to see whether this looming crisis will quietly solve one of its most dangerous dilemmas. That uneasy silence around his fading health is what will feed the darkest theories about what happened to him, and why his death would soon be handled with such secrecy. As Henry Fitzroy grows weaker behind closed doors, the distance between him and his father becomes as chilling as the illness itself. Henry VIII knows his only acknowledged son is gravely sick, but the king does not rush to his bedside. Officially, there is a practical reason: fear of contagion. Diseases that attack the lungs, whether called consumption or suspected to be something even more vile and terrified. Tudor doctors. A monarch who already saw himself as the last fragile pillar of his dynasty, could not risk exposure. So instead of a final embrace, Fitzroy receives messages, physicians, and orders delivered in the king's name, but not the king himself. Inside the sick room, that absence would have been impossible to ignore. This is the boy who had once been lifted up in front of nobles as proof of Henry's strength, the child granted titles no other royal bastard had held. Now, as his breathing becomes a struggle and his body weakens, the same father who shaped his entire future remains a figure heard about rather than seen. Attendants move carefully, lowering their voices, managing visitors, reporting each change in his condition to those above them. The air grows heavy with the sense that decisions are being made elsewhere about what should happen if, or when, the worst comes. Outside, the court adapts with unsettling speed. There is no great public campaign for prayers, no extended vigil that would have surrounded a recognized heir. Instead, the news of Fitzroy's decline passes through private conversations and guarded letters. Those who once pinned hopes or plans on his potential begin quietly adjusting their expectations. Some look toward the possibility of a future son by Jane Seymour. Others return their attention to Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, each carrying her own political complications. Fitzroy, still alive but fading, becomes less a central figure and more a problem the court may soon be spared from solving. For the young duke, every day brings a narrowing of possibilities. The hunts, councils, and ceremonies that once defined his life are replaced by the careful routines of the sick. Measured sips of drink, attempts at food, turns in bed to ease the pain in his chest. He is surrounded by people, yet increasingly separated from the father whose approval shaped his rise, and from the wider world he was trained to navigate. As his illness moves toward its final stage, what remains is a kind of suspended reality, a powerful kingdom waiting to see whether this inconvenient, half-acknowledged heir will recover and force them to face the question of his future, or slip away and leave only silence where a potential prince once stood. That silence is exactly what the next part of his story will exploit. When Henry Fitzroy finally dies, the way his body is handled, the speed, the secrecy, the almost deliberate smallness of it all will turn this quiet, hidden decline into something that looks far more sinister. The lonely end inside that guarded room is only the beginning of the mystery that grows around his name. Henry Fitzroy's final day doesn't begin with a public crisis. There are no frantic bells, no proclamations, no crowds called to pray. It starts inside the same guarded, shrinking world his illness has created. A chamber where the air is heavy, the curtains are drawn to keep out chill and glare, and every sound, every cough, every footstep feels louder than it should. He is 17 years old, but his body moves like that of a much older man. Breathing costs him. Speaking for more than a few words at a time is an effort. Those around him can tell the balance has tipped. They are no longer hoping for recovery, only watching how the end will come. The people at his side are not the great lords who once stood by him at ceremonies, but the ones who manage the quiet business of dying. Attendants, a few senior servants, possibly a chaplain, called to offer the last comforts of faith. They know the forms. Prayers are said, perhaps softly in Latin. A final confession may be heard. Somewhere beyond those walls, messages travel up the chain to inform those who must be told. But inside the room, time slows down to the rhythm of his weakening pulse. The boy who was groomed to move confidently through court life now lies still, reduced to small movements of his head, a tightening of fingers, a struggle for air. When the final moment comes, it likely passes without shouted words, no grand speeches. Just the gradual failing of lungs that can no longer keep up. For a brief instant, everything in that chamber pauses. The people nearest to him register that the rise and fall of his chest has stopped, that the fight is over. Then the practical rituals begin. Eyes are closed. The body is straightened. The bed is cleared and the space readied for the next stage. There is grief, perhaps genuine among those who have served him closely, but also an immediate awareness that what happens to his body now will be controlled as carefully as his life ever was. Outside that chamber, news spreads in a restrained, almost cautious way. There is no thunderous announcement to the kingdom, because officially this is not the death of a crowned prince. It is the loss of a powerful duke, the king's acknowledged son, but one whose existence has always sat uncomfortably within the rules of succession. Courtiers receive the information, measure their reactions, and adjust their plans. For some, it is a personal blow. For others, it is a grim kind of relief. One more uncertainty removed from a political landscape already reshaped by Anne Boleyn's execution and the king's June marriage. Yet even in these first hours, something about the handling of Henry Fitzroy's death feels off. There is no rush to plan a grand funeral, no open invitation for the court to pay their respects. Instead, arrangements are made quickly, almost briskly, as if speed itself has become a priority. His body will not lie in state for the crowds to see. It will be prepared, sealed, and moved under conditions that look less like a farewell to a near prince, and more like the disposal of a problem no one wants to discuss. That decision to treat his remains with such visible haste and secrecy is what turns a tragic but understandable death into the beginning of a darker mystery that still haunts his story. Henry Fitzroy's death was barely allowed to settle before his body became a problem people wanted off their hands. The young duke had lived like a near prince, but the plans for him in death were anything but royal. Instead of preparing for a grand lying in state, those in charge moved quickly to contain the danger they believed his corpse might pose. Illnesses that attacked the lungs were feared as fiercely as open war. A dead body was seen not only as a source of grief, but as a potential carrier of infection. That fear shaped everything that happened next: the speed, the secrecy, and the cold practicality. The first step was to make the body safe enough to move. Embalming in Tudor England was far from modern, but for someone of Fitzroy's rank, it followed a familiar pattern. His internal organs would be removed, both to slow decay and to lessen the risks if his illness were contagious. Those organs were usually buried separately in a small container, often near the place of death or in a nearby chapel. His face and limbs would be treated with spices, herbs, and preservatives, then bound and wrapped tightly. Finally, his body was placed in a lead-lined coffin, the heavy metal forming a sealed barrier that kept in odor and, people hoped, disease. What is striking is not that these rituals were used. They were common for high-ranking figures, but how quickly they were pushed through and how little ceremony surrounded them. There was no extended period where courtiers or dignitaries could file past to pay their respects. No great public procession was announced. Instead, the focus seemed to be on getting the preparations finished and the coffin out of sight. The boy who had once been displayed like a symbol of royal strength was now being handled as something that needed to be contained and cleared away, as if the less people saw of him, the safer the court would be. The choice of who oversaw these arrangements also says a lot. Responsibility largely fell not to the king personally, but to powerful relatives by marriage men like Thomas Howard, whose family was tied to Fitzroy through his wife, Mary. They took on the practical burden, paying for the embalming, organizing the coffin, arranging transport. In theory, this was an honor, a sign of respect and duty. In reality, it allowed the crown to step back, keeping the process at arm's length. Officially, everything could be framed as decent and orderly. Unofficially, the speed and distance made it clear that the court wanted this chapter closed with as little public attention as possible. All of this set the stage for the most disturbing detail of his final journey. After a life of rich fabrics, royal houses, and elaborate displays, Henry Fitzroy's coffin did not leave the palace in a carriage draped in black or flanked by a line of mourners. It was loaded onto a plain, straw-filled cart, the kind used every day to move supplies and ordinary goods. There were attendants, but only a few, and they followed at a distance. No crowds lined the route. No trumpets announced that the king's son was passing by. It looked less like the funeral of a near prince, and more like the quiet removal of something the palace was trying very hard not to talk about. That decision, the choice to send him into the next world in a way that looked almost deliberately humble, did more than anything else to fuel the sense that there was something about his death, and the danger attached to it that those in power wanted to hide. When Henry Fitzroy's coffin rolled away from the palace in that rough, straw-filled cart, it wasn't just a practical choice. It was the moment his death slipped fully into the shadows. The route was planned without fanfare. No banners, no slow tolling of bells, no crowds lining the way as they would for a prince. The young man who had once ridden out in front of nobles now left the heart of power in almost total silence, wrapped in lead and wood, jostling over the same roads used for grain and firewood. Only a handful of attendants followed at a distance, more like escorts for a supply delivery than mourners for the king's firstborn son. Their destination said even more. Instead of heading toward a great royal church in London, the cart made for Thetford, deep in Howard country. The decision to bury Fitzroy there, in the priory used by his wife's powerful family, kept him physically and symbolically away from the main royal stage. In life, he had existed in an in-between space acknowledged, but never fully accepted. In death, that limbo became permanent. He would lie not among the kings and queens of England, but among the ancestors and kin of the very nobles whose fortunes had been tied to his rise. It was a comfortable, respectable resting place on paper, but it also kept his memory safely off the central map of Tudor power. The burial itself matched the journey. Quick, controlled, and quiet. There was no grand public requiem, no sea of torches stretching into the night. A small group of clergy and officials fulfilled the necessary rites, speaking the prayers that eased the soul into the next world. There may have been genuine sorrow, especially from those who had served him closely, or from his young widow, Mary, but that grief stayed contained within a small circle. To the wider court, and certainly to the people beyond, the whole affair passed almost like a rumor, heard of, noted, and then overshadowed by the next royal event. What made this even more unsettling was the contrast with what might have been. Fitzroy's education, titles, and marriage had all been built as if he might one day stand at the center of a succession crisis. He had been trained to carry himself like someone who could matter on a national scale. Yet the way his body was handled after death told a different story, a story where the safest path was to minimize his presence, both physically and symbolically. That tension between the life he was groomed for and the way he was laid to rest is what gives his story its lingering unease. It set the stage for later generations to look back and ask the questions his own era tried not to speak aloud. Was this just fear of disease and embarrassment over illegitimacy? Or was there something about his death that those in power could not afford to leave open to public scrutiny? Henry Fitzroy's body might have left the palace quietly, but the questions his death raised refused to stay buried. As soon as the shock settled, people at court began to fill the silence with explanations, and some of them were darker than the disease that likely killed him. In a world where Anne Boleyn had just been executed as a traitor and poison had become one of the favorite words to describe betrayal, it was almost inevitable that the same idea would cling to Fitzroy's fate. If a disgraced queen could be accused of plotting against the king himself, why not against the son who once stood in the way of her security? Rumors began to link his decline to the months before Anne's fall. Whispered stories claimed that she had spoken of him bitterly, that she resented his place in Henry's affections, and the way his existence reminded everyone that the king was capable of producing sons, just not with her. From there, the leap to poison was easy for frightened minds. People suggested she had arranged for slow-acting toxins to be given to both Fitzroy and Princess Mary, undermining their health over time. There was no solid proof, no confession, no intercepted vial of venom. But in a court already primed to believe the worst of Anne, The idea that her reach might have extended to Henry's son fit neatly into the narrative being built around her downfall. Henry VIII himself seems to have leaned into those suspicions, at least in private, presenting Anne as a threat not only to his own life, but to the future of the dynasty, helped justify the brutal speed of her destruction. If people accepted that she had targeted Fitzroy, then the boy's death could be woven into a larger story of treason and deliverance. The king saved from a corrupted queen, now tragically bereaved of the son she had supposedly tried to harm. It is a story that reinforces Henry's sense of persecution, his belief that he is surrounded by enemies, and it leaves very little room to see Fitzroy's death as the simple, devastating result of natural illness. The problem, for anyone looking back, is that these murder whispers rest on emotion and politics rather than evidence. Everything known about Henry Fitzroy's final months points to a real, serious illness attacking his lungs, progressing quickly in a way that fits with infections that terrified Tudor doctors. There are no reliable contemporary accounts of suspicious substances, no credible reports of sudden poisoning symptoms, no judicial inquiries opened into his death. What exists instead are layers of fear, guilt, and the human urge to find intention behind tragedy. His lonely decline, the king's emotional distance, the rush to bury him, and the already poisoned atmosphere of the court, all combine to make a natural death look, to many, like part of a larger plot. Those shadows never fully lifted. Later writers, dramatists, and even some historians circled back to the same questions. Was he quietly removed because he was too politically dangerous? Did Anne Boleyn, or her enemies, have a hand in what happened to him? Each retelling added weight to the idea that there was more to his end than sickness alone. Yet when stripped down to what can actually be known, Henry Fitzroy's story remains that of a young man pulled into the center of his father as dynastic nightmares, and then abandoned to a disease no one could cure. The murder rumors say more about the fear and brutality of Henry VIII, England than they do about any proven plot against the boy himself fears. It will continue to echo as the focus shifts to other theories about what exactly destroyed his body so fast, and whether the same invisible threat haunted more than one heir to the Tudor throne. Henry Fitzroy's death might have been explained away with rumors of poison, but the way his body was treated afterward tells its own story about fear, power, and shame. Once the coffin was sealed and set off in that rough cart, responsibility for what happened next shifted to one man who understood exactly how dangerous this moment was for his family and for the crown: Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. As Fitzroy's father-in-law and head of the Howard clan, he stood at the crossroads between royal duty and personal interest, and every decision he made in those days would shape how history remembered or forgot the king's firstborn son. Norfolk had already invested heavily in Fitzroy's future by giving him his daughter Mary as a bride. That marriage linked the Howard bloodline directly to Henry's only acknowledged son. In life, that connection was a great advantage. In death, it became an obligation. The king did not sweep in to command a magnificent state funeral. Instead, the practical and financial weight of the arrangements fell heavily on Norfolk's shoulders. He paid for the embalming, for the coffin, for the transport, and for the burial itself. On the surface, it looked like a loyal noble stepping up to honor his royal kin. Underneath, it also meant the crown could keep a careful distance from a death that made the regime look fragile. The choice of burial place was just as revealing. Norfolk did not fight to have Fitzroy laid to rest among kings in London or Westminster. Instead, he took him into the Howard heartland, to Thetford Priory, a religious house long used as a family resting place. On one level, it was fitting. A great duke bearing his son-in-law among illustrious ancestors, giving him a respectable, even prestigious tomb. On another level, it quietly sidestepped the awkward truth of who Fitzroy really was. In Thetford, he became less the almost prince and more the noble relative, absorbed into a lineage that could honor him without inviting the kind of public scrutiny a central royal burial would have brought. For Norfolk, this was a calculated balance. He needed to show devotion and generosity, both to satisfy the king and to secure his own family's reputation. At the same time, he had every reason to keep the whole episode discreet. The Howards had risen by playing the Tudor game with ruthless skill. They understood that too much open mourning for a boy, who might once have been a rival heir, could look like nostalgia for a future the king had not chosen. So the funeral was carried out with care, but without spectacle, the sort of ceremony that fulfilled every obligation on paper, yet left behind very little for the wider world to see. In the end, Thomas Howard's role turned Henry Fitzroy's burial into a kind of controlled disappearance. The Duke gave him a place among the great dead of his own house, but in doing so, helped move the king's son out of the center of English memory and into a side chamber of history. From there would be all too easy for later generations to overlook the boy who once stood so close to the throne until the strange mix of secrecy, haste, and half-honor around his death and burial began to draw dark curiosity back to his name. Henry Fitzroy's quiet removal to Thetford might have suited the Howards and the king's immediate needs, but it left one figure standing at a strange emotional distance: Henry VIII himself. This was the man who had once paraded his illegitimate son before the realm as living proof of his strength, then kept away from his sickbed out of fear or convenience when disease took hold. Now, with Fitzroy buried far from the royal heart of London, the king faced a reality he had spent years trying to outmaneuver. His only acknowledged son was gone, his carefully constructed backup plan for the throne erased in a matter of weeks. The first hints of Henry's reaction are not tender laments, but reports of shock and grief filtered through letters and chronicles. Those close to him recorded that he took the news hard, yet even that sorrow was bound up in his own view of destiny and betrayal. This was not just the death of a boy he had once favored. It was another blow to a king who believed heaven owed him male heirs. To someone like Henry, who saw his lineage as central to God's plan for England, Fitzroy's death could easily feel less like random misfortune and more like part of a pattern of cosmic frustration. That sense of being personally wronged by fate colored everything that followed. Then came the contradiction that has haunted accounts of this story ever since. Henry had allowed, perhaps even ordered, that his son be buried with speed and secrecy, removed from court in a way that looked almost deliberately small. Yet, when word reached him that Fitzroy had been laid to rest without the full pomp and ceremony his rank might have warranted, anger flared. Reports suggest the king expressed displeasure that his son had not been honored more richly. On the surface, it sounds absurd. He was furious about an outcome that flowed directly from the kind of quiet, controlled handling he himself had set in motion. But that clash between orders and emotions is very much in character for Henry VIII. He was a ruler who often chose caution or political calculation in the moment, then raged afterward when those choices made him feel weak or exposed. In Fitzroy's case, he had reason to fear disease and scandal. A large public funeral for an illegitimate son might have raised uncomfortable questions about succession and legitimacy. Yet when confronted with the stark reality, a near prince buried like a noble relation rather than a royal heir, his pride, his grief, and his need to see himself as a loving father all surged back. The result is a strange double image. A king who allowed his son to vanish quietly from the stage, then bristled at the very invisibility he had helped create. That tension would shape how Henry behaved going forward. Instead of dwelling openly on Fitzroy's memory, he shifted his focus onto the one hope that still seemed possible: A Legitimate Male Heir by Jane Seymour. Within a year, the birth of Prince Edward would give him exactly that, and provide a convenient way to close the emotional and political wound Fitzroy's death had opened. Yet beneath the surface triumph, the story of his firstborn son remained a crack in the narrative Henry liked to tell about himself, as a king blessed by God, as a father destined to found an unshakable line. The uneasy mix of secrecy, anger, and distance around Fitzroy's burial is a glimpse of how deeply that crack unsettled him, even as he tried to bury it along with the boy. By the time Henry Fitzroy's coffin was lying in the quiet church at Thetford, his story should have been over. A life that began in scandal and rose to dizzying favor had ended in a dark, rushed burial far from the main stage of Tudor power. But death didn't stop the court from rewriting him. In the months and years that followed, Fitzroy slowly shifted in people's minds from a sickly teenager who died young into something more unsettling. A warning, a missing piece, a ghost haunting the question of who was meant to sit on England's throne. A first way this happened was through comparison. When Prince Edward was finally born to Jane Seymour, the court could not help noticing echoes of Fitzroy in the tiny new heir. Both were fragile boys in a world that demanded physical strength. Both carried the crushing weight of their father's expectations. And when Edward himself later died young, after a relentless disease that ravaged his body, people began to draw lines backward to Fitzroy, to Prince Arthur before them, to the idea that something in the Tudor blood might be cursed. Henry's firstborn son became part of a pattern, one more example of how often youthful promise in this dynasty ended in a grave. At the same time, Fitzroy's absence helped smooth over some of the hardest political questions. With him gone, it was easier for Henry and his advisors to present Edward's birth as a clean, divinely approved solution to the succession problem. There was no longer an acknowledged, half-royal young man in the background who might claim, or be pushed toward, the crown. Over time, official records and court narratives leaned into that simplicity. Fitzroy's name appears less and less as the years go on, not because he was unimportant, but because remembering him made it harder to tell the tidy story of a dynasty that had finally produced the right heir. Even so, he never quite disappeared. In places like Framlingham, where his remains were eventually moved, his tomb and effigy kept his memory alive in stone. Local people knew who he was. The king's son, the duke who died too young. Quiet inscriptions did what the court had not acknowledged his closeness to the center of power without trying to turn him into either a hero or a villain. For visitors, standing before his monument meant confronting how different Tudor history might have looked if disease had not cut him down at 17. He became, in that sense, an embodiment of unrealized history. The King England almost had, the line that never started. That is the space where his story still lives today. Henry Fitzroy is not remembered as a great ruler or a notorious traitor. Instead, he lingers at the edge of the main Tudor narrative, a figure whose brief life exposes just how unstable that world really was. His rise shows how far an illegitimate child could be pushed toward greatness when a king was desperate. His death and secretive burial reveal how quickly that same child could be erased when he became inconvenient. And the fact that we are still asking what really happened to him, what killed him, why his body was hidden, why his memory was allowed to fade proves that, no matter how carefully the Tudors tried to control their story, some shadows refused to stay where they were put. Long after Henry Fitzroy's body was sealed away in stone, the questions around his death kept evolving, shifting from court gossip into something closer to a historical riddle. That riddle has drawn in not just writers and historians, but modern doctors and researchers, trying to read the clues left in scattered descriptions of his final illness. They have no blood tests, no preserved organs, number-neat medical files, only fragments, mentions of consumption, notes about a rapid decline, hints that his lungs were the main battleground. From that limited evidence, three main theories have emerged about what really killed Henry VIII's firstborn son. The first is the one most people in his own time would have recognized: a form of tuberculosis, the disease commonly labeled consumption. It fits the broad strokes: weight loss, weakness, breathing difficulties, a sense of the body being slowly eaten away from inside. Some modern scholars suggest it may not have been a slow, years-long case, but an aggressive form triggered or worsened by another infection. In that version, Fitzroy's death is still horrifying, but not mysterious. He is simply another Tudor victim of a common, deadly disease that their medicine could not fight. It is a narrative of tragedy, not conspiracy, and for many researchers, it remains the most plausible explanation. The second theory moves into darker territory. Some historians and medical commentators have argued that the pattern of symptoms, particularly the speed with which he seems to have gone from active court life to the grave, looks more like a virulent lung infection, such as pneumonic plague. That illness attacks fast, filling the lungs, suffocating the victim from within over days rather than months. If Fitzroy died of something like that, it would explain the panicked fear of contagion, the rush to seal his body and laid, and the desire to get him out of a crowded royal center quickly and quietly. In that reading, the straw-filled cart and the secretive burial are less about shame and more about terror. The court treating his corpse like a bomb that could still go off. The third theory is subtle and more unsettling in a different way. The idea of a shared vulnerability running through the Tudor male line. When people look at Henry Fitzroy alongside Prince Arthur and Edward, the 6'3" young men of royal blood, all dead before their lives properly began, all from illnesses that ravaged their chests, it becomes tempting to see a pattern. Some modern writers have suggested a genetic weakness, a condition that made Tudor sons particularly susceptible to respiratory disease, or made common infections far more dangerous in their bodies. In that version, Fitzroy isn't just unlucky. He's part of a built-in flaw in the dynasty his father tried so desperately to secure. None of these theories can be proven beyond doubt. There are no autopsy records in the modern sense, no preserved tissue to test, only descriptions shaped by fear, politics, and the limited medical language of the 16th century. Yet taken together, they reveal something important about Henry Fitzroy's place in Tudor history. Whether he died from consumption, a lightning-fast plague, or a hereditary weakness, his body became the canvas onto which his world projected its deepest anxieties. Terror of disease, terror of dynastic failure, terror of plots and poisoned bloodlines. In life, he was the boy raised to be an answer. In death, he became another question the Tudors could never fully control, a reminder that even kings cannot always dictate who lives, who dies, or how their stories will be told centuries later.